Hi everyone, and welcome to this recording of the live stream I conducted last week. I talked with Sebastian Zimmeck about privacy, data, and software development and tried to answer as many of your questions as possible. This was kind of my first live stream event that was held that way. So there are a few technical issues, like the sound is a little bit off. It's still a very interesting discussion, so here it is. Well, hi everyone. We are here for this first live stream event where we are going to talk about privacy, data, and the implications for software development. And I do have a very special guest today. It's Sebastian Zimmeck, the leader of Privacy Tech Lab at Wesleyan University. And Sebastian is going to introduce himself in a second. I'd just like to give you a quick overview about what we're going to do today. So we're going to have this small welcome that I'm conducting at the moment. Then Sebastian has a small keynote presentation, or he's going to give an introduction of about 10 minutes into the topic, and also introducing himself a little bit. And then we will have extensive time for your questions about privacy, about how to use data, how software developers can use data of their users in a respectful and in a proper way. And we already have some questions that were asked here in the live chat. Two questions have been asked, and also in the Padlet that you can find right in the video description below this live stream. Where you're also able to ask your questions if you don't want to use the YouTube live stream. This just as a little welcome message. And now I'd like to give the word to Sebastian to actually tell us a little bit more about his work and the connection of privacy, computer science, and what Privacy Tech Lab is doing.
I say a few general words and give some practical tips on, especially how iOS developers can develop their apps in a more private and secure way. Before doing that, though, a few disclaimers. So this is not legal advice. This is for informational purposes. And I should also add, it's highly dependent on, where your users are. If you're in the US, different privacy laws will apply then as if you are in a country of the European Union, for example. And we here at the Privacy Tech Lab, we are doing a privacy research in iOS apps and other apps, web apps as well. And, this is here at Wesleyan University. I'm an assistant professor here. It's a small liberal arts university in Connecticut in the United States. And our main focus here in the Privacy Tech Lab is really working with developers and providing technology that helps developers to write more private and secure apps. So that said, let me tell you the 5, top tips I would say that you as a developer should follow. In the spirit of being an iOS developer, what you find is that Apple actually places a big weight on privacy. And by extension, that also applies to your own apps that you write. So the first point I want to say is you need a privacy policy. So every app needs a privacy policy. And in fact, as you know, you can't even publish an app on the App Store without providing the link to a privacy policy. And if you are a prominent app, Apple will actually check your privacy policy, whether that matches what your app is actually doing. And the way we see it here at the Privacy Tech Lab is really that developers should own the privacy policy. This is a legal document, but it is really something that developers should be involved in as well. And you can think of it as similar as licensing, right? I mean, a license, an open source license, the MIT license, for example, is a legal document, but it is really part of the software development process. And, GitHub provides integration with that. And the privacy policy is a similar legal document that should be embraced by developers. And if you're a freelancer, for example, you can provide an additional service to your clients if you provide a privacy policy for them, for example. And if you're developing your own app, then it's your responsibility anyways. Now, where do you get a privacy policy? Well, there are templates, there are generators that you can use. And I would suggest starting with that. If you're a bigger company or bigger app, then you can probably afford to get a lawyer, but that is not necessary for the standard app. What you should describe there is how you collect data, what kind of data you collect, to whom you disclose data, how you use data, and your data management practices. For example, do you store data in an encrypted way? Do you transfer data in an encrypted way? These are the kind of practices. One point, and it gets me to my second tip, is that it is your responsibility to disclose the third parties that are integrated in your apps. So, for example, if you have an ad network or an analytics service in your app that is using location data, then you are responsible for disclosing that fact to your users. If you think about it, that makes sense because the user does not have any connection at all to the third party, right? They don't know your app contains this third party library. So it is your responsibility to disclose that fact. And some of these third parties, they provide you actually with text or your privacy policy that they ask you to include. So that is the first point where I would look at. If they don't provide that, then you would need to provide your own description of that. The third important point that is related to that is that you are responsible for controlling the third parties on your app. So that means if, for example, your app is not using location data, you are actually not allowed to let a third party use the location data permission. So you should be only giving that type of permission to third parties that your app is using anyways. So that's an important limitation for how third parties can use users' permission. Fourth, to the extent possible, you should use standard libraries and API for privacy and security relevant mechanisms. So, if you have encryption in your app, if you transfer or store data in an encrypted format, don't invent your own cryptography, use the standard libraries and, use them well, try to learn them well. There's enough error potential for properly using, these technologies, and it's actually not trivial always. And so focus on that and, do not come up with your own solutions. The same is true for authentication. If you authenticate your users, you might want to think of maybe a federated authentication as opposed to handling the authentication yourself. Then the fifth and final tip that I would say is, and that's more like a general point, build security and privacy into your app from the beginning, and keep this work up to date. So that means update your privacy policy when your app functionality is changing, and don't consider this as a one-time thing or something that you attach later to your app. Consider this as part of your normal workflow. And that is really what we want to do also here. We want to provide tools and technologies for iOS developers, integrate privacy and security into their normal development workflow. So this, would be my 5 short recommendations. And, there's a lot more to be said on this topic. And, I'm glad that we have this opportunity of this discussion here. And I would welcome any questions. With that, I would give it back to Brian.
Thank you, Sebastian. These were I think as a summary of the most important and also most solvable problems that US developers can come across. So I think that's a very handy selection of tips. Just for for everyone who is new, I know we are a small group of people that are discussing right here. We have about 15 people, and it's interesting that this topic of privacy seems to be really not that sexy in comparison to other things, but definitely to all of you who have joined us, thank you very much. You're doing an important step towards a better software, towards software that is also more user-friendly and more human-friendly in that respect. And just the hint that if you want to ask questions, you can use the YouTube live chat. You can also use the link in the video description below to access a Padlet that doesn't require a YouTube account. So if you want to use that, you're also free to go ahead with that. So we already have some questions, though. You had the opportunity to ask questions since yesterday. I have seen some questions here. And I'd like to start with some of the questions that were asked prior to our video, which are quite interesting, and also cover what Sebastian told us a second ago, which is many indie developers do not need complex privacy policies since they do not collect any data remotely of the users, or they might use iCloud for that. Do you have any suggestions to them? Should they write their own privacy policy?
Yeah, so whether you are using your own database or you are using, and maybe that is what the question is getting at, whether you are using maybe the iCloud account of a particular user, right? That supplies the data. That is something that I would disclose in the privacy policy. So it's a little bit fuzzy, and I give you one example. What the law is, right? I mean, if you want to think of it really in a big perspective, right? What we have here for a few years now, we have these new privacy laws that are coming up, but many interpretations are not clear of what these privacy laws actually mean. And so, for example, the most basic example is when a law is talking about the collection of data, what does that actually mean? Does that mean I need to send that data off of the device and store it, maybe even for a certain amount of time? Is that collection? Or does collection mean I only keep the data on the device, maybe just for a few minutes, and then it will be deleted? There is, in many laws, not a definition of what collection of data actually is. What does that mean? The only law that I'm aware of is the Children Online Privacy Protection Act. But other than that, you don't have definitions. The law is not as specific to that. And so, this question, as it asks about, okay, information is stored on iCloud as opposed to maybe your own database, goes to that problem, right? We don't know at the moment what collection means. And so I, as a developer, I would go that route, that I would disclose really, in factual terms, what it is that my app is doing. And I think, that will serve you very well and, will make it transparent. And if you have a bigger app, then, certainly regulators will look into your privacy policy. If you're very small, you have very few users, maybe you can escape that a little bit, but I wouldn't take that risk, and I would rather, err on the safe side and describe a little bit more as opposed to less.
And the next question goes into kind of the same direction, because if you do have a privacy policy, and I think every application needs to point to a privacy policy. So if you go into App Store Connect and you upload your app to the App Store, then you have to supply a link to a privacy policy. And the question is, does Apple look at the privacy policy during review when the app is submitted, or is it really just a mandatory field that isn't checked?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and the answer is I don't know. There is a video of Tim Cook from an interview on MSNBC. Maybe we can share that also in the in the description to the stream here, where Tim Cook explicitly says we are comparing what is written in the privacy policy to what an app is doing. Now the question is, that is a very difficult undertaking. If you want to automate that, that's not an easy thing to do. And so I don't know to which extent this is happening at the moment, but I would say in general, the more users your app has, the more popular it is, the higher it ranks on the App Store, the more likely it is that it will be reviewed either by someone at Apple or by regulators. And you have to keep in mind there are these two things. One side is you are subject to the review of regulators. So in the US, that's, for example, the Federal Trade Commission. And you also have the Apple developer license agreement that subjects you to certain requirements. For example, that you need to have a privacy policy. So if you look into their license agreement, you will actually find that there is there's a section about a privacy policy, and it says what your privacy policy should contain. And so independently of whether that is actually checked, you are legally obligated from different perspectives, from the Apple developer license agreement as well as from statutory law, to provide various types of information. And I'm sure that over time the review process will only get more sophisticated. For example, a couple of years ago we didn't have this mandatory field, right? It was not necessary to actually post a link to your privacy policy. Then that was introduced. I think going forward we will see also more checking of the content of the actual policy.
And now a question from kind of the other direction, except firms and enterprises using third-party applications, what's the percentage of consumers reading through the privacy policies? Do you have experience with that?
That's a very good point. Yeah, I don't have concrete numbers, but the answer is probably very few. I don't know the percentage, but there is one study that actually measured how long it would take you if you would read every policy that you encounter, right? If you sign up as a user for an app or use a website, right? If you would read all those policies, you would only spend your life reading policies, basically. And the way I like to think about it is it's not so much about that every user actually reads your policy, but it's more about you want to make the statement, right? And you want to lay out your practices, and if somebody is interested, then they can refer to that. You're providing transparency. It doesn't mean that everybody's reading it and everybody's well informed. That's probably not the case, but you want to be transparent and you want to put out this constitution of your app, this privacy constitution of your app that is ready to be read. You want to think about it, you no matter which country you're living in, right? I mean, all of us are not reading all the laws that applies to us, right? Like, the United States Constitution or the German Constitution or the French Constitution or these kind of things, right? But we know it exists. And when it becomes important, we could look it up. And so in that sense, that is how I think about privacy policies as well. So I wouldn't focus too much on the the actual reading percentage, that is likely low, maybe single digit percentages or something like that, if even. But I would focus more on okay, this is something, this is a statement, this is a declaration I make, and I provide this for purposes of transparency.
So now we had a very legal perspective on the topic. That there are also, of course, societal perspectives and philosophical perspectives towards privacy. And one of these questions is it's rather a statement that privacy and social life don't really get very well together. And I can actually share that from my own experience, because there are certain services that I do not use, and these services like messaging services or also social media services that I do not work with, because I do not like the way these companies are treating user data, and also how these companies are very much related to aggregating data as a business model, instead of providing products or services that you actually pay for. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean that's a very difficult question. So I think there are multiple ways of seeing this point. I would say in general, you are right that certain applications lend itself to be more privacy protective than others. And the social aspects of app certainly is more on the difficult end of things. That said, I think what we are currently witnessing is a sort of evolution of social media, and you can think of it in terms of social terms, ethical terms, doing what is right. But you can also think of it in terms of business, right? Because ultimately, if you want to have a sustainable business over the long run in this environment, then you would need to make sure that you respect the user's privacy. And I think that was probably not so clear 10 years ago, or maybe even 5 years ago. But I think it is pretty clear to many companies now. And if they are in this space, that is what they have to deal with. And then ultimately it becomes a decision of the individual user, right? And we see this playing out. For example, if you look at Facebook, right, the question now is, okay, should there be full encryption of their messaging apps, right? You have other competing messaging apps, right, that are fully encrypted. And so there is a discussion in these companies as well, how they should approach this kind of emerging age of privacy, and at the same time maintain their business model. And so I think ultimately it's not so much a question of just one or the other, but it's an evolution, and I think we will see more convergence towards more privacy protective social media. I don't think it will go away. I think that's just human nature. We are social human beings. We want to communicate with other people, but I think we will see more privacy protections built into these communications. And then for the individual users, they just have to decide, okay, I want to use this app or I want to use the other. And to some extent, many companies are placing emphasis on that. And that's why I mentioned, especially as iOS developers, Apple is placing an emphasis on privacy. Right? That is one of their, big points, really. I also know that other companies, Google last year had, their big year of privacy actually, and that was really one of their core tenets of the year. And so many companies embracing that, and I think within their business model trying to move towards more privacy protection.
So we're talking about the big players here, of course, that do realize that. They also do have or many companies like Amazon, for example, they collect more and more data, and they need to be even more, or emphasize privacy aspects even more. But when we have a look now at the individual developer, and there's also a question related to that topic. If you, for example, want to create a subscription service that collects user data. I'm just going to read the question. How can we as developers offer a subscription service without collecting any user data, or at least or the least amount of data needed for a subscription service? So I could answer maybe a little bit of the technical aspect, and you might add the legal aspect to that. So I think there are several ways to do that. So data minimization is always a good start. If I'm talking now from the perspective of an iOS developer, you can decide, of course, between doing your own subscription service and also doing in-app subscriptions. Now, here's the problem: Apple doesn't want you that you leave the application, or that you leave the Apple ecosystem. So you always have to pay, of course, the 30% that Apple takes from you when a subscription is made through the Apple ecosystem, which at least does not require your users to create yet another account and having the need to transfer user data to another service. Of course, what you can also do now is working with the sign in with Apple service, which is a great way to actually let the users choose if they'd like to share their own and personal information, or if they'd like to use kind of a proxy email, for example, that allows you or allows them to communicate with the service. And if you leave the Apple ecosystem and build your own subscription service that, for example, can be used in through a web service like Netflix, for example, does, so that you can sign up on their website and pay a smaller fee than if you actually sign up using the Apple service. This is, of course, a possibility, but even anonymizing data, if you'd like to do that yourself, comes with some problems, because anonymized data isn't always that anonymized, because you have to put kind of a lot of expertise into anonymizing, and Apple does that in certain areas with differential privacy, and they started out at very particular with very particular features like the emoji keyboard that collected data on how many or how often a certain emoji was really used. And differential privacy really gives you the possibility to make sure, or at least very sure, that data cannot be followed back to the original user. So you have to put quite a bit of thought into that. But I think from the perspective of a developer, and also the amount of bureaucratic effort that you have to put into thinking about subscriptions, is to always collect the least amount of data that you possibly can to make something work. And if you can rely on a service that a user already uses, and do not have to create that yourself, because payment or authentication and so on works already very well, then I think this goes hand in hand with what Sebastian told you in his 5 key tips, is to use existing frameworks that cover these problems, and then be transparent about how you use them and what kind of data you collect, and how you deal or how you use that data.
Yeah, absolutely. I would just reiterate the point that you make, Brian. I think I would actually draw the line not so much between subscription and not subscription, but I would rather say if you are handling any kind of payment, whether that's a one-time payment or, a recurring payment. I think from a practical perspective, it makes the most sense and is the most, secure way really going about it is to look into the different providers, starting with Apple, right? How does Apple process this? Because then it doesn't actually go through your hands, right? You don't see the payment data actually that is taken care of by Apple. And, if you don't want to use that, there are third parties, Stripe and other payment processors. And so, you can look into these and say, okay, that is the library that I want to use. And you can check, how much, what percentage they would take off from your, income and pick the one, that you like. I would say, that is the way really I would go about this. And, I would strongly advise against small app developers collecting payment data from any kind of financial data from users, because as Brian said, anonymization is hard, and I would say it's not even hard; it's impossible. It is differential privacy gives us a certain guarantee. And just to illustrate also the example that Brian gave, with the emojis, right? What Apple is doing is that maybe you are just one person in the world who is using a certain set of emojis, right? I mean, maybe there are thousands of emojis, but this particular combination is only used by you. And if you're using this set of emojis on a different service as well, then you might be recognized across these different services. And so the idea of differential privacy is with a very small probability, it will be transmitted to Apple. One emoji is different from the one that you actually picked, right? There's only a small probability. And that kind of mechanism prevents, securely that you will be recognized, across devices. And that is a statistically proven way. But other than that, it's really hard to anonymize. The general saying is if you want to publish data and you want to be sure that, that it's anonymized, don't publish it. That is really the only way to do it.
And the way kind of Apple illustrated how they were using it, there's a great article in their in their machine learning journal. I think they published it there how they were using differential privacy when they started out, I think with iOS 10. But the problem really is that if you look at data, and Netflix did that, I think, in 2006 with the Netflix prize, they wanted to create or they let you create an algorithm that could predict user ratings. And what two other computer scientists did was to take this data set that Netflix provided for this competition, and Netflix actually anonymized user data, user names, and also added some noise to the ratings themselves. And what happened was that these computer scientists combined that, and that's what Sebastian just outlined. They combined it with another data set, namely IMDb, which is also related to movies and films, and they could just link those two data sets, and by that identify the people that actually wrote these or rated something. So this is really the point of anonymization. What Sebastian also said, that it's kind of impossible. And earlier, I think already back in the 90s, there were some experiments done with census data, and the scientists found that you only need 3 data points to identify almost 87% of all Americans, which are just your zip code, gender, and date of birth. So this makes clear a little bit more, I hope, how sensible we need to deal with data and also with metadata that that you might think is relevant, and that you don't have to pay too much attention on that. So following that, we might want also to go into some other frameworks, because some questions were asked about Flutter, for example, or Firebase, which are quite popular. And maybe you already have a take on using these, maybe not only data storing frameworks, but also UI frameworks such as Flutter from Google, and the implications.
Yeah, that's a very good point. These frameworks, we looked a little bit into this actually, because what we try to do is, right, we try to take iOS app source code and code from libraries and generate a privacy policy from that, right? That's our work on Privacy Flash Pro, and we are at the moment doing this for Swift in the app, and for Swift and Objective-C for library code, right? But we actually received also some requests from developers, and they asked us, oh, do you also provide, React Native or, other newer frameworks, right? Development frameworks. Some people also asked about Android, but, and so that is really our perspective there, right? How can we integrate these frameworks into our technology stack to also cover those? And that is something that we are currently considering. I think just purely if you look at the framework, if you look at Flutter, or if you look at React Native or others, there isn't, to my knowledge, there isn't a whole lot to say about differences in terms of privacy, because it depends a lot really what you do with these frameworks. Ultimately it depends, you write your app, and that really determines your kind of privacy level. Under the hood of these frameworks, there might be things going on that, data is cached differently, things like that. And, that may leave room for side channel attacks, things like that. But, in principle, how these frameworks are structured, there isn't really a material difference, at least for, these big ones, really, that we were discussing about here. Of course, if you have a very small, developer, they come up with a new framework, I'm not sure if that, that may pose problems. But if you take, the big ones really, that are often supported by, bigger tech companies really, then there isn't a whole lot of difference versus writing native apps in that sense.
Yeah, from the quality of software point of view, I'm not the biggest fan of non-native code. I must admit. So to also answer the question, will Flutter take over native code? I don't think so. And this has many implications, actually. If you think about using non-native frameworks, you can do certain UI stuff, so UI-related stuff. You can make your standard web requests, display data, and so on. But when it comes to device-specific features, and some iOS products really heavily, and that's, I think, also the reason why iOS software mostly has a higher quality standard than other or apps that are released on other platforms first, or that are released as an MVP, and then you have your cross-platform code, and later on you will go native, because you can add additional features and present your users with a better user experience. And that is especially true if you use things like, for example, augmented reality, or certain network communication services, Bluetooth communication, and so on, that also have a security layer on iOS or iPadOS that you need to work with. And if we talk about services like Firebase and iCloud and CloudKit and Parse in the past, and Amazon Web Services, I think there is always, and I think when we're talking about Firebase and Amazon services, then Sebastian might have to add something related to privacy as well, because data definitely leaves the container or the containment of your app, and it also kind of leaves the Apple ecosystem. So if you even if you add a sign-in with Apple and to try to combine that in some way, which I wouldn't advise, but from my point of view, and that is true for many content delivery networks that rely on Amazon services, and you tell your customers, and sometimes even public service institutions do that, related to privacy. They tell their customers or other people that rely on their services, even public services, that data is stored within our institution. But later you experience, well, they are using kind of a content delivery network that they haven't been aware of. And so data is actually wandering off to Amazon. So also because someone asked, how can you implement that with Firebase? I think that is a decision that you have to make. Is Firebase the right one for you? Is the pricing structure correct or right for you? And there are alternatives, of course. You could go with Realm, for example, or it's MongoDB Realm now, and implement your own server. Of course, you have to have a VPS and install it there, and you might invest more money first because you need to host everything yourself. But you at least control the data that you collect, and depending on the field or the audience that you're targeting, this could also be a business benefit for you. So if you imagine you're working with students and children, then you might really want to emphasize the privacy aspect of your applications and go all in and design for privacy right out of the box, and starting with that in your early considerations. But now maybe, Sebastian, you could also add to that.
Yeah. I would also, I would echo that, and I would say that's certainly a good point. If you are especially, working with, these special populations, then I can see that as a selling point. I would say though, if you do that, you have to be really, really precise about this, and don't allow yourself to make any mistakes in this. And if you are doubtful about that, I would rather go with a standard solution of using, Firebase or some other standard provider, and then disclose that to your users, right? Because there is just less potential for errors. If you have to set up your own server, and you have your own database, and your own database scheme and all these kind of things, right? You have to get a lot of things right. And I think that is something you should really only do if that is the main focus of your app, and if that is something that you deeply care about. That is not the case if if that is not your main selling point of your app, or if you're just simply also too small, then I would rather go with some standardized solution and then disclose this. But I think it's an absolutely great point that Brian is saying, that if you go to an institution, a company or a university or a foundation or something like that, and they say, we store your data, it is probably some kind of cloud provider where they are storing that data. And that is something that you would also need to disclose in your privacy policy. Users must be aware of that. And that's also kind of a funny thing, right? If you think about, these new COVID-19 apps, right? All that, for example, Apple and Google are doing is, okay, we provide you this infrastructure, we provide you the specification, but we actually don't store any data. That is up to you, implementers of this app, right? And now it might be that the countries or the states who implement these apps might say, actually, let's store our data on Google servers, because maybe they use Firebase or something, and then it actually comes to Google, but not because of the reason, that Google or Apple provide these APIs, but rather because of a conscious choice, that this will be used in these apps, right? And so my, again, to repeat, recommendation would be by default, use, the standard solutions, and get that right, disclose it transparently to your users, And only if it's a big selling point for you, then, I would go and make the effort and set up your own privacy and security infrastructure. But that's very hard to get right.
We also have some statements here that we might need to consider. The first one, and this encloses kind of the services that we just talked about, like Firebase, or Amazon services, or even Apple, someone saying they're all bad. Apple is just as bad as Google. And another interesting point, which is that important infrastructure should be no one's property, which I definitely think is a very good point, and a very good friend of mine also proclaims that things like search engines and knowledge and important infrastructure elements that are part of the internet are at the moment owned by just a few companies, and they do not have democratic legislation on how to deal with that. So having said that, and having a look at the importance of the infrastructure that we're using, I mean, we at the moment are not using a public broadcasting service. We're using YouTube, and if YouTube does not decide to show this live stream to as many subscribers that I have, then YouTube does that, and we have to live with the consequences. And this is not, but the decision on how this has to work is done by a private company with interests in making money. And we are here in kind of we kind of are dealing with an academic discussion, or at least we're in the business of providing knowledge to everyone who has joined us here. So giving this infrastructure, or making this infrastructure public, I think is kind of an important or interesting aspect. And what would you say about they're all bad? Would you agree or disagree?
Yeah, I would say that's probably a little bit overgeneralization here. So I would say, there are certainly things, that did not go well in the past, and I think for many of these companies it's a bit a struggle. I mean, if you think about Google, right, that's it's an advertising business in the end, and that's how they make money. And now they have to walk this fine line between privacy on one side and their commercial interests on the other side. But ultimately, and that's really what I believe, is these two things go hand in hand. And I think what we will see is, over the long run, I think we will see a development towards more privacy protection. And as you mentioned, Brian, these kind of more higher values, these more bigger aspects. Okay, this is a private company. Yes, I absolutely agree. That's tricky, and I think to some extent probably the laws will adjust a little bit to that. But I also feel that these companies will feel the responsibility that actually comes with that. So that's what you see, for example, in the presidential election in the United States, right? Do you, how do you moderate that at all? Do you allow political advertisement, right? These are all discussions that we are having, and the companies cannot really escape from that. And I think in the end it will converge towards a good middle ground. I hope. I give you one other example. If you think of Facebook, right? Facebook at this point, there are billions of people signed up, from many different countries. And if you think about it, maybe 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years out, right? I mean, it's a great resource for social science research, right? How did people live in that time? Or, what did they say? Or even if you believe this is somewhat filtered, right? You are not really the person that you are on the social network. That's still a great resource to do research. And I think, that will become like a database of many humans who lived at a certain time, right? And that is something that is really a public, that is of public interest. And I think these kind of really applications will come more to the forefront over time. And the companies that are in this business and offer these services, they will have to deal with these questions. And I think they will feel a certain responsibility to do the right thing. So as you see, I'm optimistic about the future. I think it is understood. We are at this junction where the problems are understood. They're not solved, but I think we are on the way of solving them.
Yeah, I think that is also a very good conclusion for our discussion here, and also answering all the questions. Although we haven't been so many viewers in this live event, I think we have had the chance to answer quite a few very interesting and important questions. There are also questions related to more to tech and to things that are not related to our privacy topic today. So I'd like to postpone that to a later event, so that we might do that again in the future. But for now, I think it is clear that at least for my channel and from my point of view, as how education towards software developers and iOS developers should go, is that they understand the importance of privacy, that you know about the implications of privacy, and that you have tools and people out there that care about that very deeply. And I'd just like to mention again that Sebastian and his team created Privacy Flash Pro, which is a completely free tool created in academic environment. It's open source. You can have a look at it at GitHub. You will find one of my latest videos on that. On my channel, and it really gives you the possibility to create privacy policies with very little effort, and also shows you where in your code might be places or libraries that you used that do have privacy implications. So I simply point you towards that as an excellent resource, and just having to answer one of these tech-related questions, I think now is a great time also for Mac software. If rumors are true and Apple is going to introduce ARM-based computers, and you have to recompile your applications, and you have to put some work into that, then also go the extra step and have a look at at your code. Maybe use Privacy Flash Pro and think about all the privacy implications to make your app better towards that respect, and give your users at least a chance of a transparent view on how their data is used, and talk to them via your user interface, and let them decide what data they'd like to share, and don't be like a vacuum cleaner and just take what you can get. So that as my last and final suggestions in this video. I thank you so much, Sebastian, for joining this video series.
Thank you, Brian.
And thank you all for watching, and we'll see you in the